Imagine being arrested in broad daylight, humiliated, handcuffed, and dragged away, just for sitting on a park bench reading a book. Now picture the shock on those officers' faces when they walk into court, only to discover the judge presiding over their case is the very woman they arrested. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a reckoning you won't forget. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Under a sky so perfectly blue, it almost seemed artificial. Golden Gate Park pulsed with the soft rhythms of life. Children darted between trees, their laughter a bright percussion against the muted rustle of leaves. Couples wandered hand in hand, lost in afternoon conversation. And at the edge of a still pond, beneath the shade of a sycamore, sat a woman alone on a bench, silent, composed, and unaware that her life was about to be upended. Her name was Regina Miles. She was the kind of figure most passers-by might glance at and then quickly forget poised, serene mid-50s, dressed with the sort of elegance that speaks more to inner discipline than vanity. A thick hardcover rested in her lap, its spine creased from real use. She read like someone who'd fought hard for time to do so. This moment quiet, unremarkable, was for her rare and precious. But peace for some is always conditional. The hum of the city was broken by the sudden grating screech of tires on pavement. A police cruiser jerked to a halt along the curb just 20 yards away. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. The silence that followed was not natural. It was taut, uncertain. Two officers stepped out, white, tall, uniforms crisp. Their movements were brisk, their posture stiff with manufactured authority. They didn't scan the area. They didn't ask questions. Their eyes locked onto Regina immediately. She looked up, brows furrowing slightly, a page of her book still open in one hand. "Ma'am," one officer called his voice, clipped and cold. "We need a word with you." She closed her book slowly, carefully. Her composure never cracked. "Is something wrong?" "Got a call about suspicious behavior in the area," the second officer said, already advancing. "We need to know what you're doing here." Regina blinked, the absurdity of the question hitting her like a slap. She gestured toward her book. "Reading," she said evenly. "It's a public park." But the officers weren't looking for explanations. They were scanning, measuring, weighing her silence, her skin, her solitude against some unspoken standard. "Can we see your ID?" The first one demanded, voice rising just slightly. Her pulse quickened, but not from guilt. It was the familiar chill that came with knowing you were being treated like a problem before you were a person. "Why am I being accused of something?" "It's routine," the second said. But there was no routine in his tone. There was only suspicion, assumption, a subtle edge sharpened by centuries of repetition. A small crowd was gathering now, slow, curious movements from those walking nearby. Eyes watching. Phones lifted subtly, uncertainly. Regina reached into her bag, deliberately slow, pulling out her wallet. Her driver's license passed from her hand to his. He read the name aloud, as if it were a punchline. Regina Miles. "What's your business here?" "Ms. Miles." Her response was quiet, measured. "I live in this city. I come here often. Is that not allowed? There was a long pause. Then the officer handed her ID back, but neither of them moved. Instead, the questions continued. Do you always bring a book like that? Are you here alone? Is someone meeting you? Regina's spine straightened. Years in courtrooms had trained her to hold steady under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a trial. This was a trap. I'm not answering anything else unless you tell me what I'm being accused of, she said firmly. And just like that, the moment changed. Don't get smart with us, the first officer snapped. We're doing our job. I know the law, Regina replied, calm but firm, and I know I'm not breaking it. But reason was not welcome here. A hand reached for her arm. You're resisting. She hadn't moved. What are you doing? She asked, voice raised now, alarm spreading across her face. Stop resisting. The officer barked again louder this time, as if it were a script being read for an audience. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A teenager 15, maybe 16, held up a phone camera blinking red. Yo, she's not doing anything, someone called out. Regina's hands were behind her back now. Cold metal bit into her wrists. Shame flushed her cheeks as they walked her to the cruiser. She didn't struggle. But her eyes scanned the crowd, stopping on that teenager with the camera. Hold on to this, she seemed to say, without words. Someone needs to. The car door slammed. The siren never sounded. In the back seat, staring through the metal mesh, Regina felt a strange stillness. She had stood in dozens of courtrooms. She had defended the voiceless, the falsely accused, the unjustly profiled. But she had never once imagined that she'd be the one in handcuffs carted off like a threat for sitting on a bench with a book in broad daylight. She looked down at her shaking hands, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. But underneath the humiliation, another feeling began to simmer, low, slow, and potent. Rage, not the kind that burned fast and reckless, but the kind forged from years of quiet patience. From watching the same cycle play out in her community over and over again. From knowing that justice for people like her was often optional. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She planned. And though the officers didn't know it, though, the crowd didn't know it, though even Regina herself could not yet see how it would unfold. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of theirs. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed like a swarm of insects, casting a cold pall over the holding cell. Regina Miles sat rigid on the metal bench hands, still aching from the tightness of the cuffs that had only just been removed. The cell was stark concrete walls, no clock, no windows, just the clatter of distant keys and the occasional burst of radio static. She had argued in courts more intimidating than this negotiated cases that rattled veteran attorneys, but nothing compared to the sense of smallness she felt now, locked in a box, not for who she was, but for what they assumed her to be. Her breath was steady, but her thoughts were not. They raced like wind-blown papers in a storm. She tried to focus on the facts, the arrest, the officer's refusal to explain their actions, the crowd, the camera. Every detail etched itself into her mind like evidence for a trial that hadn't yet begun. Hours passed without a word. Her watch had been taken, time bent and warped. At some point, a young officer appeared at the bar's clipboard in hand, avoiding her eyes. You've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer, he said flatly, as if reading from a cue card. On what grounds? Regina asked, voice sharper than intended. You can discuss that in court, he replied, then walked away. Left alone again, she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, fingers interlocked. Her jaw tightened, not from fear, from focus. This wasn't new. Not really. This was what her clients had faced. She had seen their frustration, heard their outrage. She had believed them. Now she felt them. By the time she was released on bail, the night air hit her like a second set of cuffs being removed. Free, yes, but not really. Freedom that followed humiliation was never pure. She spotted Claudia leaning against her car, arms folded tight against the cold. Claudia rushed forward as soon as she saw her. "Reggie," she breathed, her voice breaking. "Are you okay?" Regina nodded slowly. Her body wanted to say otherwise. She felt a tremor rise in her shoulder and pushed it down. "I'm fine," she said, though the words sounded foreign. The ride back to her apartment was mostly silent. San Francisco's streets were quieter than usual, the fog creeping in through alleyways. Regina stared out the window, face bathed in the blur of passing lights. Claudia kept glancing at her knuckles white around the steering wheel. "They had no idea who you were," she finally said. Regina turned her head slightly. They didn't care. Claudia pulled up to the curb. Regina didn't move at first. Then she opened the door, slowly stepping out like someone learning to walk again. Inside her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Tidy, controlled. But it felt different now, like a scene she no longer belonged in. She didn't change clothes, didn't eat. She walked straight to the kitchen table, pulled out a stack of legal pads from the cabinet and sat down. Claudia stood in the doorway, watching her with worry, etched deep into her brow. "You're not resting?" Regina shook her head. "This can't wait." "For what?" "The lawsuit." Regina nodded, flipping open the first pad and uncapping a pen. They picked the wrong woman. But it wasn't anger in her voice. It was something heavier. Grief, maybe. Disappointment refined into purpose. That night, Regina began what would become a meticulous process, not just of legal preparation, but of reclaiming something. Every page she filled was a step away from victimhood and toward accountability. She wasn't naive. She knew the system, knew how much power could twist truth into shadows. But she also knew how to fight back, and more importantly, how to make it stick. By morning, the video had already begun circulating. The teenager had posted it with a simple caption. She was just reading a book. Regina didn't know it yet, but the clip would strike a nerve. Viewers weren't just watching another incident of racial profiling. They were watching the familiar become unbearable again. The quiet dignity of a black woman arrested for existing. The officer's casual cruelty. The echoes of history baked into every frame. Messages flooded in former clients, colleagues, strangers. Some shared legal advice. Others shared stories. One email stood out. A woman in her 60s wrote, "I thought the world had changed since I marched in '68. But this reminds me why we can't stop marching." Regina read it 3 times. The following evening, she met with 2 former students, both now attorneys, who offered to help her build the case. It wasn't just about winning. It was about setting a precedent, about dragging hidden norms into the light. They sat in her living room, papers spread across the table, laptops, open, voices low but determined. They spoke not only of the arrest, but of the broader implications, patterns in local policing, other complaints filed against the same officers, departmental procedures that quietly protected misconduct. Claudia watched from the hallway, a silent sentinel. She had seen Regina fight for others. Now, for the first time, she was witnessing Regina fight for herself, and in doing so, for all the others who never got their day in court. By midnight, the room was quiet again. Everyone had gone. Regina remained at the table, shoulders stiff, eyes tired but resolute. She looked down at the legal pad in front of her. In bold letters at the top of the page, she'd written just 3 words. This won't fade. It wasn't a vow. It was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. By the third day, the video had over 4 million views. It began circulating in activist circles, picked up by journalists, and amplified by social justice organizations across the country. There was no need for added commentary. The footage spoke for itself: a composed black woman sitting alone on a park bench, approached by 2 white officers, then dragged off in handcuffs, while a stunned crowd murmured in disbelief. In less than 90 seconds, the video encapsulated generations of suspicion control and humiliation. But what elevated it beyond a routine case of racial profiling was the revelation that the woman in the video, Regina Miles, was a sitting judge. That detail reframed the narrative. The public didn't see just another anonymous black woman being harassed. They saw the system swallowing one of its own, a legal authority who'd spent her life upholding the very rules now used against her. The irony struck a nerve, and something shifted. This wasn't just injustice. It was proof that no amount of education decorum or professional stature could protect a black body from being criminalized in public. Regina didn't seek the spotlight. When major networks requested interviews, she declined. She wasn't interested in personal vindication through the press. Her focus was precise the lawsuit. But even behind the scenes, the noise was growing. Clergy leaders quoted her name from pulpits. Retirees wrote letters recalling the civil rights era with weary familiarity. Young activists printed her image onto protest posters with the words, "Still Fighting," stamped across the bottom in bold. And Regina felt it, this tidal wave of attention pressing against the door of her modest apartment. It humbled her. It unsettled her. But more than anything, it gave her clarity. She realized the case had grown beyond her personal violation. It was now a vessel, a rallying point for a city teetering between frustration and transformation. Her story had lit a match, and the people were holding up torches. Every day she worked at her kitchen table, drafting motions, reviewing previous civil rights cases, outlining her arguments with unflinching discipline. But this time she wasn't alone. Her team had grown. 2 of her former law students, Deshawn and Mia, both brilliant products of the very mentorship Regina had cultivated, now sat beside her almost daily, each bringing their own fire to the mission. Claudia managed the logistical chaos: emails, press inquiries, filing deadlines, late-night takeout orders when the hours stretched long. It wasn't just legal prep. It was resistance in motion. Beyond her home, the movement was evolving. Town halls, once sparsely attended, filled with concerned citizens demanding transparency from the San Francisco Police Department. At one packed meeting in the Bayview district, Regina stood before an auditorium of elders and teens, mothers and veterans, and spoke not as a judge, but as a neighbor. "I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last," she said, her voice even. "But this time, we won't look away." She didn't sugarcoat the truth. She spoke of policies crafted to protect officers, of training designed to minimize accountability. She named the quiet terror of walking while black sitting, while black breathing, while black experiences not written into law but enforced all the same. When she finished, the room erupted not with applause, but with a solemn rising to their feet. A standing tribute not to her, but to the power of standing at all. From that gathering came new ideas. Regina with the help of a local nonprofit, launched a monthly restorative justice circle, bringing together civilians and off-duty officers in a space designed for truth-telling. It wasn't easy. The conversations were raw, emotional, and sometimes confrontational. But they were real. And that Regina believed was where healing had to begin. She also began lobbying for legislative changes, partnering with civil rights attorneys to draft a bill requiring implicit bias training for all new recruits statewide. It was a long road, uphill, and full of resistance, but the momentum was there. People were watching, listening, pushing. Then came the news that would once again tilt Regina's world on its axis. Late one evening, while preparing documents for her case, she received a call from the court clerk. A misconduct hearing had been scheduled for two officers accused of excessive force during a recent traffic stop. Routine procedure. Except this time, it wasn't routine at all. Judge Miles, the clerk said hesitantly, you've been assigned to preside. Regina paused, pen frozen mid-word. Officers, the clerk's voice lowered. Blake and Monroe, the same men who had arrested her in Golden Gate Park. There was no immediate response. Regina sat in silence, her mind trying to parse the impossible. Could it be a coincidence, a bureaucratic twist of fate, or something else entirely? But questions faded beneath a heavier realization. She would be the one to weigh the evidence. She would be the face of justice in a case tangled with her own history, and everyone would be watching. That night, sleep refused to come. She stood at the window, staring out over the quiet city streets, wondering what justice demanded of her now. She had every reason to recuse herself to avoid even the appearance of bias, but something deeper held her in place. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ego. It was about integrity. If she believed in fairness, true impartial fairness, then she had to trust herself to carry it out, even when the air was thick with contradiction, even when every emotion urged her to run. In the days that followed, she reviewed the case file carefully. The charges against Blake and Monroe stemmed from a separate incident involving a 17-year-old Latino boy named Mateo Ramirez. The arrest had turned violent. Mateo's injuries were photographed. His statement was clear. The parallels between their treatment of him and of her were undeniable, not identical, but hauntingly familiar. Still, Regina knew the courtroom was sacred. It was not a battleground for personal reckoning. It was a place to uphold the law, to measure truth, to protect the process. She would lead with clarity, with control, with conscience. What she didn't yet know was how the officers would react when they saw her again this time, not in handcuffs, but behind the bench robe, on gavel in hand. The moment was approaching, and the whole city was waiting. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. The murmurs and shuffling that normally preceded a hearing were replaced by a curious charged silence, the kind of stillness that clings to a room before something irreversible happens. Word had spread unofficially but forcefully that Judge Regina Miles would be presiding over a misconduct case involving officers Blake and Monroe. Those who came expecting routine were about to witness something unprecedented. In the hallway outside the courtroom, officers Blake and Monroe stood with their attorney. Their posture was stiff, but their faces betrayed something deeper: discomfort, confusion, and the barely veiled tension of men trying to maintain control in a moment they no longer owned. They hadn't spoken much during the car ride from the precinct, but now Blake whispered, "Are we sure about this? The judge, it's her." Monroe's jaw twitched. It can't be. It wouldn't be allowed. Their attorney, a man seasoned in procedural chess, replied calmly, "It is allowed, and it is happening. The system is impartial. She will be too." But his reassurance fell flat. They had seen the video. They had heard the fallout. And now, as the bailiff called the room to order and the doors opened, all three men stood still as Regina Miles entered from the side chamber, her robe flowing, her expression unreadable. She took her seat at the bench without looking at them. Instead, she looked over the courtroom, the attorneys, the observers, the clerk. She adjusted her glasses and spoke with the clarity of someone who knew her words mattered perhaps more now than ever. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." Every movement in the room followed her voice. Officers Blake and Monroe sat stiffly, shoulders taut, eyes occasionally flicking toward her, unsure whether they should look at her or avoid her gaze altogether. For the first time, they seemed like men who understood consequences, not as an abstract idea, but as something personal. Regina felt their discomfort. She felt her own body remembering the moment in the park, the condescension in their voices, the click of the handcuffs, the eyes of the crowd. But she didn't indulge the memory. Not now. Her job wasn't to relive the past. It was to ensure the present met the standard she had sworn to uphold. The prosecution began laying out the facts with precision. Mateo Ramirez, age 17, had been stopped by Blake and Monroe for a broken taillight. The situation escalated within minutes. According to testimony and medical records, Mateo had been shoved, pinned, and struck after asking why he was being detained. The prosecution brought in video evidence from a store security camera nearby. It showed Mateo raising his hands compliant before being tackled to the pavement. Regina listened without reacting. She took notes, underlining key points, marking inconsistencies. The courtroom was watching her as much as they were watching the case. They wanted to see if she would flinch, if her posture would betray even a flicker of bias. She gave them nothing but professionalism. But inside, she felt the strain of a deep, exhausting sorrow. During a recess, the two officers huddled in the hallway again, their voices low and urgent. Blake ran a hand through his hair, eyes wide. "I don't understand how she can be impartial." "After what happened, it doesn't matter," Monroe muttered. "We do our part. We testify. Let the lawyers handle the rest." But even as they spoke, they knew it wasn't just about legality anymore. It was about optics, about the sudden shift in power they couldn't reverse. They had cuffed her in broad daylight. Now, she sat in judgment over them, wielding authority they never thought she possessed. Back in the courtroom, Regina called for testimony. Mateo took the stand. He was nervous voice, quiet at first. But as he recounted the night, the confusion, the fear, the bruises, his voice grew stronger. He looked at the officers only once, then kept his eyes forward, focused on Regina. "I didn't fight them," he said. "I was scared, but I did what they said. I just kept thinking, this isn't supposed to happen if you do what they say." Regina nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of his words without breaking her judicial role. She asked no questions. Her eyes returned to her notes. The defense responded with care. Their attorney tried to paint the officers as reactive, placed in a tense situation, following standard procedure. "My clients feared escalation," he argued. "They made a judgment call in the moment." But judgment, Regina knew, was not an excuse for harm. It was a responsibility, one too often exercised with impunity. When Officer Blake took the stand, the room shifted. His voice cracked slightly as he was sworn in. He glanced at Regina only once and quickly looked away. I misread the situation, he said eventually. I thought the kid was reaching for something. I reacted. The prosecutor leaned forward. Was he Blake? Hesitated. No, but I didn't know that at the time. And now the prosecutor asked. Blake didn't answer immediately. Then his voice smaller, he added, Now I know I was wrong. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something perhaps the first crack in the armor. Regina kept her expression neutral, but her chest felt tight. These were men who had manhandled her, humiliated her, spoken to her as if she were invisible. Now they sat exposed, vulnerable in the way that only the truth can make someone. But justice, she reminded herself, was not about vengeance. It was about balance, accountability. And the law at its best could be a mirror that made men face themselves. As the day wore on, the courtroom took on a different kind of silence. It wasn't tense or hostile. It was expectant. Everyone could feel something unfolding, not just a trial, but a reckoning. When proceedings adjourned for the day, Regina rose slowly. She gathered her papers, placed her pen in her folder, and looked toward the defendant's table. Officers Blake and Monroe stood. Blake hesitated. It looked as if he might say something, an apology, a thank you, a question. But then he thought better of it. They turned and left in silence. Regina remained at the bench a moment longer, alone in a room still holding its breath. She had done her job. The hardest part was yet to come. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning of the ruling. The press occupied the back rows, their cameras respectfully silent but ready. Community members packed the gallery, their faces taut with anticipation. Some had followed the case since the beginning. Others had never stepped foot in a courtroom before, but felt in their bones that this moment wasn't just about law, it was about truth, about dignity, about what justice might finally look like when stripped of pretense. Regina Miles entered with quiet certainty, her robe trailing behind her as she approached the bench. The room stood as she entered, and for a moment all sound seemed suspended. She looked neither triumphant nor bitter. She looked resolved, calm, as if she had wrestled with every corner of herself to arrive here. She glanced toward the defendant's table. Officers Blake and Monroe sat with their attorney, their expressions drawn and solemn. This time, they did not exchange whispers or restless glances. They sat still listening. Regina cleared her throat and began to speak. The role of law enforcement, she said, her voice steady and unwavering, is not simply to enforce the law. It is to do so with integrity, fairness, and restraint. When officers step outside those bounds, especially with force, they do not just harm an individual. They erode the foundation of public trust. She paused to let the words sink in. No one moved. This case has revealed more than a single lapse in judgment. It has exposed a pattern of overreach, of unjustified escalation of a mindset that sees difference as danger. This pattern cannot be ignored, and it will not be excused. She went on to detail the consequences. Both officers would face a formal disciplinary record. They would be placed on unpaid suspension. They would be required to complete an extensive state-supervised retraining program centered on implicit bias de-escalation tactics and community accountability. Their history would follow them not to punish, but to remind. To mark that harm was done and acknowledged. She looked directly at Blake and Monroe. Accountability is not revenge, she said quietly. It's the beginning of responsibility. When she struck the gavel, a sound that echoed like the end of something long overdue, the room remained silent. There was no cheering, just a collective exhale. As people began to file out, Regina remained seated. Officers Blake and Monroe stood slowly. Before leaving, Blake turned toward her, eyes downcast. He hesitated, then said, barely audible, "Your Honor, I'm sorry." Regina gave a single quiet nod. She didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. True change would be measured not in words, but in actions repeated over time. That evening, Regina walked the length of her apartment in slow, thoughtful steps. The case was closed, but the real work, the kind that stretched beyond courtrooms, was far from over. She placed her gavel on the bookshelf next to a framed photo of her mother marching in Selma. She looked at it for a long time. Later, she attended a community meeting in the Mission District, standing not as a judge, but as a listener. People told stories of stops of fear of sons who kept their hands on the steering wheel just a beat too long. They cried, and they laughed, and they shared the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. An older man in the crowd stood and said, "You didn't just hand down a ruling today. You gave us back a little faith." Regina thanked him, but made no grand speeches. Instead, she spoke softly to a few teenagers afterward, reminding them that justice isn't only what happens in court, it's what we demand from the spaces we live in every day. In the weeks that followed, conversations bloomed across the city. San Francisco's mayor called for a citywide review of use of force policies. Regina was invited to Stanford Law to speak not about her case, but about the future of judicial leadership. There, she announced the creation of a new fellowship supporting aspiring civil rights attorneys from underrepresented communities. Change, she knew, wouldn't be swift. It never was. But seeds had been planted, and people were watching, pushing, believing. One afternoon, weeks later, Regina returned to Golden Gate Park. Not by accident. She wore no robe, carried no papers, just a book. She found the same bench now washed in sunlight and sat. The couple walked past and nodded in recognition. A boy on a bike waved. No one stared. No one asked questions. She opened her book, resting it on her lap, just as she had that day. But this time, there was no interruption, no accusation. Only the sound of wind in the trees and the quiet knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had taken a step forward, and she had helped carry it. Regina Miles's story began on a quiet afternoon beneath the shade of a tree in Golden Gate Park, with nothing but a book in her lap and peace in her heart. What followed was a chain of events that would not only challenge her personally, but shake an entire community into reflection. Wrongfully arrested by two officers who saw her not for who she was, a respected judge, but through the lens of suspicion, rooted in centuries of racial bias, Regina found herself thrust into the very system she had spent a lifetime upholding. Her experience in that holding cell, stripped of dignity and voice, mirrored the pain that so many Black Americans have endured. But unlike many, Regina had the tools and the resolve to fight back. She returned not with vengeance, but with clarity. She used her legal expertise to build a case against the officers who violated her rights. More importantly, she transformed personal harm into public purpose. Her lawsuit sparked national attention, but she didn't stop at court filings. She engaged her community-mentored young lawyers, held space for painful conversations, and advocated for real policy change. What no one expected, not even Regina herself, was the twist of fate that would place her back in the same courtroom. This time not as a defendant, but as the presiding judge over a misconduct case involving the very officers who had arrested her. Faced with the ultimate test of objectivity, Regina did what few could. She delivered justice with grace, impartiality, and profound moral strength. Her ruling was firm not to punish, but to restore integrity. She reminded everyone watching that accountability is not about revenge, it's about the responsibility to protect every citizen's dignity, regardless of who they are or how they look. But the impact didn't end with the verdict. Regina's story became a catalyst for dialogue and reform. Her quiet resilience reignited a movement that demanded not just awareness, but action. From law schools to city halls, her experience became a case study in how justice can be challenged and championed from within. And in the most symbolic of closures, Regina returned to that same bench in Golden Gate Park, not as a victim reclaiming space, but as a leader reminding us that no matter how often we are silenced, we still have the power to speak, to fight, and to rise. The lesson in Regina's story is both sobering and empowering. It reveals that injustice can happen to anyone, even those within the very structures designed to prevent it. But it also shows that courage, when paired with wisdom, can shift the ground beneath our feet. The true strength of Regina's journey wasn't in her legal prowess alone, but in her refusal to be consumed by bitterness. She chose the harder path to stay in the system and fix what's broken from the inside. That's a call for all of us, not just to bear witness to injustice, but to act, whether through voting community, organizing, listening more deeply, or standing up when it's uncomfortable. We each have a role in the story of justice. In today's world where division and fear so often dominate headlines, Regina's story reminds us that transformation begins with the decision not to turn away. Her fight wasn't just hers, it belongs to all of us. Let her story be a mirror and a guide. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes or stirred something in your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share powerful, true stories like Regina's stories that shine a light, provoke thought, and inspire real change. Together, let's build a future rooted in justice, compassion, and courage. Stay with us. The next story is already unfolding.